I'm John Batchelor. Larry Kudlow, CNBC and Kudlow Radio on the Weekend is here with me. Climate science, climate change, global climate disruption. The President of the United States traveling to New York during the organizing sessions of the United Nations to address a climate science summit, a climate change summit. Speaking to the world, listening for the leadership of the United States, I believe the metaphor that the president used was the United States is going to step up to the plate. Well, also stepping up to the plate is Ed Lazear of the Hoover Institution, who's written most recently at the Wall Street Journal about climate change and about how it is that the solution is not necessarily all on the side of carbon tax or draconian measures to cut back on GDP and growth, but adaptation. Ed, a very good evening to you. Adapt. Adapt means change for all of us. Climate change is constant. We're told this at least since the medieval warming period of the 12th and 13th century that led to, say, vineyards in Great Britain, where there are no good vineyards today. So we're changing again. Is carbon tax the answer for the big states? Is that where they want to go? Good evening to you, Ed.
Good evening. Well, carbon tax obviously is a step that could move us in an appropriate direction, but the problem is that the issue that we face is so grand and so enormous that my view is a carbon tax is just not going to do anything. And the reason for that is based on about a year and a half's worth of study when I was at the White House. A large part of this, as we know, has to do with emissions by other countries, not simply by the United States. Now, that doesn't let the United States off the hook. We are the world's second largest emitter, and on a per capita basis, we are the major infringer on this. But that's an issue of fairness. It's not an issue of what we can actually get done. And if you look at the situation, and if you look at the growth of carbon emissions in the world, we know where they're coming from. They're coming primarily from China, and in the future, India will join them as they increase their pace of development. And there's simply no way that we are going to be able to get control of this situation unless we get both China and India to reduce their rate of growth and eventually turn it around. And that just doesn't look like it's going to happen. If you look at the arithmetic, the simple numbers on this, the problem is just staggering. So the argument that I make in the journal is that we shouldn't be simply basing our policies on what I believe to be false hopes. We need to be realistic and understand that some of these things may not happen, are likely to not happen, and as a result, we ought to move in a direction that is more feasible and will have us dealing with some of the changes that may come.
But Ed, I want to ask you something. I don't know if you read this article in the Journal on Saturday by
I did.
Kuhn.
Yeah, I thought it was excellent.
Really interesting article.
Yeah.
So what he's basically saying is, we know the climate is changing, but we don't know why.
Yeah.
And he said we have, none of the models are any good. I mean, the temperature hasn't risen in 15, 16 years. But he says things like, oceans and water vapor and rain, and I would add to that sunspots. We are not even modeling this stuff, so we have no idea what the climate is going to look like in the future, much less why.
Yeah, well, what he points to, I think, I read it slightly differently in the sense that I thought he did accept the notion that man is contributing to climate change, but I thought the point that you made, Larry, is his primary point, which is that there's an enormous amount of uncertainty that surrounds the science, and we don't really know exactly where we're going. Now, of course, the piece that I wrote in the Wall Street Journal doesn't take on science one way or the other. It basically assumes that the people who believe that the science is sound on climate change are correct. And the reason I make that assumption is not because I have evidence on that one way or the other, but rather because I want to focus on the economics of the situation and say, well, assume that's correct, then what can we do about it, and are we doing the right things to deal with it? And I think the answer to that is no, we are not doing the right things.
Well, let's choose one example. Do we pick winners? The Obama administration did that in 2009. Green energy. How did it work out, Ed?
Well, that's right. And I think, the problem is this, that one of the things that we thought about, and when I say we, I I'm going back to my time in the Bush administration, and we did think about this a great deal, even though the public probably thinks that we ignored the issue. One of the things that we thought about was, look, is there any way that we can ever move the world through carbon taxes, cap and trade, restrictions like the ones that the EPA is putting on? Can we ever move the world in a direction that is sufficient to address this problem? And our view was that we could not. Now, the only thing that we felt that could be done that was feasible and that might actually have an impact is to put resources into developing alternative sources of energy, and that's what the Obama administration was trying to do. They were picking winners. We think they picked the wrong one, actually. I mean, what we felt that the only one that was within a prayer of getting anything done was nuclear at the time. Nuclear is almost cost-effective in terms of competing with coal and natural gas. Wind is close. Solar was at least at that time light years away. It has come closer now. But the kinds of things that we're talking about in terms of green energy solutions are just not likely to solve the problem. And the big difficulty is this. I just want to go back to what I said before. China and India are growing countries. They're economies that are much poorer than ours. Even if you adjust for prices, the GDP per capita in China is less than a fifth of that in the United States. So they have problems that are much more pronounced from their point of view than dealing with climate changes that might occur 25, 50 years from now. That's just not first on their agenda, and no matter what they say to pay lip service to the situation, that's not what they're thinking about. What they're thinking about are 25 million people moving to their cities every year, and how are they going to find jobs for them, and that's first order.
But doesn't Dr. Coonan, look, I understand there's climate change going on, but he says basically, yes, some of it's man-made, but it's only a small percentage. The rest of it's Mother Nature,
right?
And we don't model Mother Nature.
Well, I think that I think again that's being a little bit unfair. The guys who think about this stuff are pretty sophisticated, so they do model Mother Nature. The point that I thought Coonan made, and made quite effectively, is that much of the variation, perhaps most of the variation, comes from the Mother Nature component. Obviously, the part that we can't control.
Right.
And that when you do these models, and I'm not in that field, but I certainly spend my time doing a lot of mathematical and statistical models, and I do know that those things are full of uncertainty. So his basic point is there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty out there. And given the uncertainty, we just can't be very confident that the kinds of numbers that the climatologists are giving us are necessarily the ones that are going to prevail.
So so let's just take this. That's where I was going, and that was my reading of him.
Right.
You want certain adaptations, which makes a lot more sense to me than wrecking the economy with carbon taxes and the like. But, Ed, if we're uncertain about where the climate's going, then even the adaptation part might not work.
It might not work, and it might be expensive. But the point is that it's a backup strategy. And so I think of it as a relatively low-cost hedging strategy. The thing, Larry, that I worry about, and that I pointed out just briefly in the article, is there's sort of a political correctness around this issue. So even if you accept climate change as an issue, and I'm accepting that, again, from the point of view of my piece, I'm willing to accept climate change as a reality. The point is that even if you accept it, it's almost politically incorrect to speak about alternatives. Adaptation is an alternative to mitigation. Mitigation, of course, is the word that we use to talk about ways to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that we put in the air. And it's almost inappropriate to discuss adaptation because people think that will take the wind out of our sails on mitigation. That's just the wrong way to think about this. Again, if you go through the arithmetic, the chances that mitigation is going to work to do anything, even if we take the worst case scenario, is just very unlikely, and so we have to prepare for alternatives. And so again, that's the point that I think is an important one that's been missed by most of the literature and most of the people in the policy world.
I want to press you on carbon tax. It was rejected in Australia by the vote of the people, having to do with the fact that it was not demonstrated that it was effective. They knew it was expensive. They knew it was dragging down the middle class pass, but they didn't know that there was a payoff because they're just one little country and everybody wasn't joining. Isn't that always going to be the problem, Ed, that it's expensive and you can't demonstrate that you're actually contributing because there are other countries that are going to ignore it?
Well, not only can you not demonstrate that you're not contributing, you really aren't contributing. All right, so take the two countries in the world that are the leading examples. That would be Sweden and Denmark. They have done the most in terms of mitigating their growth in carbons, and they've reduced their growth in carbon. That's great. But the same point holds for Denmark and Sweden. You know, you're talking about, with the two of them combined, about 15 million people. That's a tiny part of the whole world. Now, the question would be, you know, does that have any leadership impact? I would say the evidence on that is unfortunately negative. You know, the fact that Denmark and Sweden have done such a great job in cutting their carbon is doing nothing to reduce the carbon in China. And I don't blame China. You know, China has a completely different situation right now. There's simply no way that they are going to be induced to take actions that are against their own national interest simply to help the world with its carbon problem. They're just not going to do it. They can't afford to do it. And carbon taxes, cap and trade, you name it, any strategy that we can impose on ourselves or on any of the developed countries, that's just not going to be adopted by China, no matter how much leadership.
One more question, Larry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to reinforce that. China and India are just around the corner from Australia.
Right.
So why should Australia punish itself? And for that matter, you know, it blows over the Pacific and comes to the United States. So I never understood the logic of the punitive methods.
Unless, of course, this is about, Ed, you kindly say political correctness. Is it about political control? Does it give a voice to a party to press its advantage in Congress?
Well, I think it. Look, there's certainly interest groups that benefit from this. I mean, the green energy group, certainly the financial capital, much of it comes from where I live, right out here in Silicon Valley, and they benefit from it. There are other groups, I think, that are basically anti-industry and view this as a way to articulate that position. But again, I don't want to be too negative on this. There are many people, many Americans, and many people around the world who genuinely believe that this is a very serious issue and one that we need to deal with. And by the way, that's on both sides of the political aisle. My colleague out here, George Shultz, who I respect as much as anybody in the world, is a huge believer in this issue and thinks it's probably the most serious issue facing the world today. So even if you take that point, though, again, the issue is what can we do about it, and do about it in an effective way. And I think deluding ourselves and being silly, adopting measures that look like they're doing something but simply make you feel good and don't really have any effect on the outcome are not the way to go.
Ed Lazear, chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, that's the Bush administration, as well as a professor at Stanford University's Graduate School of Business and a fellow at the Hoover Institution. Larry Kudlow of CNBC and Kudlow Radio on the Weekend. I'm John Batchelor.